My name is Horace Huntley, and I'm born and raised here in Birmingham, Alabama. Growing up here in Birmingham, really growing up in an apartheid society. And we talk about movement. I would not consider myself an activist while I was here at home in my early days, my uh, high school days. I was not really an activist. Um, this was in the late 50s, early 60s. I guess in a way, everybody that lived here were activists in one sense or another, because it was a struggle just getting through this society, just being uh, in a place where we could um, um, survive, because it was a struggle. It was simply a struggle to survive. I grew up in a household that included my grandmother, my mother, a brother, and a sister who was younger than I, and two first cousins. So I guess some would say that was a broken home, a broken family. Uh, but it was very functional as far as I'm concerned. Uh, my mother was a licensed practical nurse. She worked in hospitals in the area. My grandmother uh, was a domestic, and she worked in various white homes around the area that we lived in. Uh, my grandmother, she was really the matriarch of the family. Um, and from my perspective, I always say that Mama, I learned more from her than from anybody else, including the professors that I studied under. Although Mama was, she was illiterate. She could not read nor write. In fact, when the mailman came, I would have to get the mail and I'd read it to her. If she needed to sign something, I would sign it. But she was so smart. She had all kinds of respect from the community. And I remember we had a white family that lived in back of us. They had a service station, and the postman would come to that service station every day to drop off mail. I would go out and I would buy candy and cookies, and I'm talking about the age of 8 to 10 or 11 years old. Uh, and we basically had some respect for each other, but there were times when, of course, they showed their colors. I remember once Mrs. Pierce, her name was Polly Pierce, and they were members of the Klan, and everyone knew that they were members of the Klan. A black woman and a white man had an automobile accident, and the police were called, the police came, and he was filling out papers and trying to take care of the business. But he was doing it fairly, because the white man was in the wrong. And so when Ms. Pierce came up, she said to the police officer, "You need to get on your job," meaning that you need to rule in favor of this white man over this black woman, regardless of whether he or she was right or wrong. That was one of those places in my life where, I was given proof of the need to survive in that society. There was another instance at that same place where I went out to mail a letter, and I asked Mr. Pierce if he would mail this letter for me. And he looked at me and he said, well, do you want me to lick the stamp for you too? And I was insulted. So I just left. I didn't say anything else. I just left. And I vowed that I would never go back into that business again. But my grandmother, we call her Mama, she went out one day and Mr. Pierce asked her, he said, is that boy still mad? Because I had been out of there for at least a month. And Mama told him, well, that boy has a mind of his own. And she came back and told me that. And she said, well, you did the right thing by not going back. And I said to this day that what Mama was doing at that point, and these are just instances of how it happened, she was feeding me what I termed to be nerve juice. And there was a saying in the Black community, you have more nerve than the law allows. And for ages, I just could not figure out what that meant. But eventually I came to the conclusion, it meant that the law, the white law that we had to abide by, did not allow Black men or Black people, period, to have nerve enough to question anything that they did. So that was sort of the way that I was initiated in Birmingham, Alabama. I remember Mama would send me downtown to pay the bills, and I would go down, of course, get on a bus, had to get on and sit in the back of the bus, ride downtown, get off the bus. If I would go to the Alabama Power Company, I had to go upstairs. I'd have to ride the freight elevator. If I wanted to get something to eat, I could do that at a little place called Newberry's, which was a little 5 and dime store. I could buy a hot dog, but I couldn't eat it at the counter. I'd have to go take it outside with me. If I wanted to go to a movie, we had one, I guess we could call it an integrated movie. It really was not integrated because Blacks went to the balcony and whites went to the bottom floor. And we always said that was one of the things that segregation did not do correctly as far as they were concerned, because we would go into the movie upstairs, get popcorn or water, and we would toss it down on the white kids, and we would leave there and run around to the 4th Avenue side, which is the Black business district, and we would go in movies there, rather than simply sitting there. But those were, children will be children. So there were some things that we were going to do that was going to question this apartheid system. I'll give you one other one. And finally, we were standing at a confectionery one night. And this is when I was probably 13, 14. But the Klan would always burn a cross in a neighboring community, huge cross. And after they burnt the cross, they would procession through our community in cars. And Mama always told us when they came through, and all of our parents tell us when they came through, you get inside, turn the lights off, because you never know what they're going to do. But as young folk, we were not afraid in the same way that our elders were. So this particular time, we were standing out. There probably were, 5 or 6 of us. And we had made a decision that when they rode through that night, we would send a message. And we did. We piled up rocks. And when they started to come through, we simply started throwing rocks at their cars, which really was, I think, very bold for that time, because you simply did not antagonize white society, particularly the Klan. But we did, and we threw rocks, and then we ran home. And that night, I can still remember that night, I didn't sleep at all, because every time a car came in front of my house, I knew that was the Klan coming to get me. But fortunately, that didn't happen to us that night. But I finished high school. I wanted to go to Tuskegee University. Actually, it was Tuskegee Institute at the time, at HBCU. My mother couldn't afford to send me to Tuskegee, so I decided that if I couldn't go to Tuskegee, I wasn't going anyplace. So I decided to join the Air Force to see the world. I joined the Air Force. They sent me, my first base was Grand Forks in North Dakota. Now you can imagine, he was an 18-year-old black boy from Birmingham, Alabama, never been in weather less than 35 degrees. And the day that I arrived in North Dakota, the temperature was 20 degrees with a wind chill of 10 below. And that was the best day of the year. When I left North Dakota, I wanted to go to an electronics school. I went to Minneapolis. After I was discharged from the Air Force, went to the an electronics school, Controlled Data Institute. And my wife, who did go to Tuskegee, she came, we met in Minneapolis, as our first home was there in Minneapolis. She got a teaching position in the Minneapolis school system. In addition to that, we worked at a community center in South Minneapolis, working with younger people, kids. I met two guys. One was Bill English, and Bill was an activist. Bill was the program director for the Sabathani Community Center. And I appreciated him and really envied him because he was a little bit older, but he was very outgoing, and he knew how to deal with questions, particularly a question that was based upon race. And I sort of fell into his orbit and tried to mirror some of the things that he was attempting to do. He was one of those that started that community center. The second person was a brother by the name of MAHMOUD EL-KATI. And MAHMOUD, of course, a historian. I didn't know either of them before we met at the center. But MAHMOUD would volunteer and come to our community center in Sabathani, and also go to the Way in North Minneapolis. And I was so impressed with Mark because I started following him around the city to see what he was doing. I decided then afterwards to, being convinced by my wife to go to the university. And that's a long story, but I wanted to have an impact like I felt MAHMOUD was having. So I decided that I was going to become a historian. And that was one incident with a professor who talked about Black history in about 10 minutes, but he was only talking about slavery. So I asked the question, well, are you going to speak more on the history of Black folk in this country? And he arrogantly said to me, is there more? And So we had an exchange, and he gave me uh, a class period to talk about the history of Black people in the country. I did that uh, after talking to MAHMOUD, and that is when my first effort in dealing with the history and culture of Black people from a formal standpoint, you know. And then I had the opportunity to meet some very good people on campus, and Rosemary Freeman was one of those, and Rosemary was the chair of the Afro-American Action Committee. We became very close friends and associates. Uh, and we, of course, planned many activities that were related to Black history and culture. And we wanted to see an African American studies department on campus. And that was one of the things that happened as a result of the takeover of Morrill Hall. Follower of the works of W.B. Du Bois. And Du Bois made a statement about Reconstruction. And after Reconstruction, he suggested that we had come under the influence of people, of leaders, or supposed leaders, who would compromise truth with the past so that they could make policy in the future. And what I've learned is that the truth has to be spoken, regardless of who you're talking about. You know, one truth is for one person, another truth for another person. That doesn't get it. Of course, you'll have different opinions on similar incidents, but as a historian, I think we have to fundamentally at least try to get to what the real truth happens to be. But in my work, I always wondered, because initially I found that in Black studies, or in any studies, we basically attempted to chronicle those who we felt were important. You know, looking at the elites. I had the opportunity, of course, to go to the University of Pittsburgh and met a guy that I didn't know prior to going, who turned out to be one of the leading labor historians in the world. His name is David Montgomery. And when I first met David at Pitt, I didn't even know that there was a such discipline as labor history. In fact, I had one of my instructors before I got to Pitt. I came back to Minnesota, and I was talking with this instructor and was asked the question, well, who gave you this topic? My topic for my dissertation was the development of the International Union of Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers in Birmingham. They were, you know, of course, working class folk. And, but that was not something that we normally did. So when I met David and we started talking about my being from Birmingham and all of the labor history that goes along with Birmingham, Alabama, you know, it was basically a natural that I would look at uh, Black workers in Birmingham. And that turned out to be a godsend because labor history and Black history were really looked upon in the same manner, like it was not important to study. In fact, when I first got back home, I had a friend of mine who asked me, "What are you teaching?" I told him Black history. He said, "Oh, you can teach that in about 30 minutes, can't you?" And he was serious. But that's the way Black history was looked upon. But by the same token, that's the way that labor history was looked upon. So combining those two gave me a perspective that I could not have gotten otherwise. So I am in perpetual debt of MAHMOUD EL-KATI on the Black history side and David Montgomery on the labor history side. They helped to create who I became in terms of my scholarly endeavors. And I'll be forever indebted to them for guiding me and guiding my career in that regard. The Oral History Project, the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, I was actually on the founding board of directors of the Institute, which was started in 1992. We had worked since, well, about at least 10 years, a little bit more than that, trying to develop the concept of the Civil Rights Institute. After the organization was started, the Institute was started, we also had decided that we were going to have an oral history project because much of my work that I had done previously was oral history of iron ore miners in the Birmingham district. And I knew that that was a good way to get the history of people who were, well, voiceless and faceless. We knew about the leaders, the Martin Luther Kings, the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworths, and others who were in leadership positions. But the people, the foot soldiers, you know, we basically didn't know them. So we decided to establish this project. When we started the interviewing, and the first interview was in 1994, and I directed that project. And over a period of several years, I guess today, by now, we have more than 500 oral histories of people who were actively involved in the movement. And I had the opportunity to sit with those soldiers and learn from them what had actually taken place, how they were successful in doing what they were doing. And as a result of that, we also wanted to develop a system by which we could get this out to people. So now the Oral History Project is online and people can access it from their computers. We've had 2 books that were written based upon those interviews. But we had also the ability to develop the archives and other means by which people who are not necessarily scholars but who just wanted to see what had happened with the movement. And we developed several uh, exhibitions, and now there are, we're at, I think there are 5 or 6 galleries of different um, different topics that is significant to the civil rights movement. In Birmingham, you're either black or white. You know, although there were other people there, uh, there were not many Asian folk. There were not many Latinos at the time that I was growing up. And the movement was a black movement. You know, you had a few white people that were involved with it, but in the main, it was black people who organized it. But now, if you look at Black Lives Matter or any of the other organizations, Color Change, um, you can see that you have people from all stripes who are actively involved and working together. And we know that there were young white kids that came down from the north to help uh, enlist people into the voting ranks in the 1960s. Um, but today, we are seeing, and that was basically, that became a regional movement, and then it evolves into a national movement. But now we have an international movement. People all over the world are concerned about what is happening all over the world. You know, when you talk about George Floyd now, you can talk about him in Minneapolis, Birmingham, in Singapore, in Cape Town, you know, and that's just showing that this movement that we are talking about is not one that's limited to a location. It is a worldwide movement, and now we're seemingly catching up to that, and it is having a profound impact. But I don't think we've seen anything yet. We're going to see that this movement is going to change not just Minneapolis, it's going to change the world. And the only reason that it's going to change the world is because people are actively involved. I say young people, but there's some old folk that are still out there. But young folk are really our future. You know, I guess that goes without saying. You know, our time is past. Never-ending struggle, basically. And young people are usually not as patient as we should be. But you know, you have to have patience. I remember once there were several of us that went to MAHMOUD, and we were complaining. You know, we're doing all of this work out here in the streets and places, and it just doesn't seem as if anything is happening. And he stopped us right there, and he said, "Wait a minute. Let me tell you one thing." So first of all, something is happening. You may not understand it right now, but it is happening. And you cannot, you don't have the ability or the wherewithal to get to a point where you're talking about stopping the movement. Obviously, you cannot stop the movement. And he said that, you know, there are people that have come before you. Who do you guys think you are? You know, Frederick Douglass was out there long before you. Harriet Tubman was out there long before you. A. Philip Randolph. And he went on to name folk and to tell us that in a movement like this, you simply have to understand that simply by getting information out to people, simply by talking to the people, the grassroots, simply by sharing the various ideas that one may have, you are adding to the struggle, and the struggle is ongoing. Now, sometimes it may feel as if nothing is happening. Vincent Hardin wrote a book entitled There's a River. And in there, he emphasized that, you know, a river, it flows very strong sometimes, and other times it's just a meandering brook. So, but nevertheless, it is always moving, and you just have to pick your spot and get involved. So I'd say to young folk, you know, you've gotten started, don't quit, because what you're doing is vitally important to the world. And if we look back 50 years, 60 years, when in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, there were times when we thought that there was just nothing else that we could do because no one was listening. But that's not the criteria that you use, whether anybody else is listening or not. You have to do what you have to do. And you have to be truthful with the world, because there are many folk out there that are not truthful. If you gather a group of people, and you'll see that changes will take place. And we've complained many times that nothing is happening, no changes are being made. But obviously, you know, I grew up here in Birmingham, Alabama, and if you I left here in 1961. If I had not come back between by time 1965 or 66, the face of Birmingham had changed, you know. However, change does not come as rapidly as we would like to see it come. But nevertheless, change comes. It's a different Birmingham today than it was when I was growing up. And it's based upon what many people have been doing. And many of them would say, well, just nothing is happening. But it is happening, and you'll see it in the long run. It does not necessarily reward you as you're doing the work, but the world will be rewarded, and you will be the reason for that reward. So I just say to young folk, keep on keeping on. Keep doing what you're doing. And don't worry about the naysayers. They will always be there. You just have to know that you're doing the right thing. Know that you are gathering truth. You're speaking truth to power. And at some point, there will be that reckoning. And in fact, it's happening as we speak.